message I'm really, really excited to share with you. We are in a panel with uh, artists, activists, researchers, clergy. I would say clergy. Yeah. It's a wide swath of people who have a long history. Everyone on this panel in recovery, but also a history of activism and creativity that I really, really admire. So this is not a formal academic panel, so there are no slides, and we're not going to read any bios because everybody here knows how to talk. So that's what we're going to do. Welcome.
Yeah, I'm on. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks to the panelists. I want to echo what you just said, John, that I really am grateful for this conference. I am socialized to academic medicine, and it replicates a lot of systems of like power and ego and things like that. And just to be here in conversation with such a diverse and interesting group of people is a treat and a pleasure and an honor. And I'm really looking forward to being in conversation. And my hope is just to have a conversation and not try to play the moderator game and be in control or guide it. I've really enjoyed meeting all the other panelists, and I would just like to talk. I'd like to talk and learn about you and about your practices and about your lives and your suffering to the extent you're willing to share about it, and your recovery and your progress toward what recovery means to you now. So I wanted to open with a really broad and impossibly broad question that in a way is I think the theme of this particular conference, but also this panel, which is just how did you enter recovery, and what does it mean to be practicing recovery in relationship to your academic work, your advocacy work, your artistic process? We could spend the entire panel on that question, but maybe just to introduce yourself and to share yourself with the folks who've gathered here. Who wants to go first?
I'll go.
I thought you would.
Somehow people are looking at me. So I am Jan. 36 years ago, I survived active addiction and have been in recovery for 36 years. And for me, it means that I have a life beyond my wildest dreams, and I want to keep it. It didn't always look that way. In the beginning, it was about surviving and getting out of trouble. But there's progression in recovery just like there's progression in active addiction. So for me, there's that discrete point when I got to go to rehab. I was young, much younger then. And when I was thinking about kind of this beginning of this question, it made me think about some of the differences. So I was treated, it was a health-related problem. It was never a criminal problem. It was never a moral problem. All of the resources that were brought to bear for me were done so because I had an illness, and I needed to recover from that illness, and I needed to be able to go on and thrive. And so that's the lens. I mean, for me, it's always been about if people receive the same level of care that I did, everyone would have an actual opportunity to get better, and recovery would be the expectation instead of a possibility for people.
Hi, I'm Paul Villinski. I'm also a person in long-term recovery. Not quite as long as Jan's, but coming up on her heels. And I grew up with an alcoholic father. He took me to my first AA meeting when I was 16. I went to my second one 16 years later. And I was very fortunate, I think, to enter recovery here in New York City, where there are 2,000 AA meetings a week. And you can find your people here in New York. And my people were downtown in Tribeca and Soho. And so I found my kind of creative recovering peers there. And I was thrilled to spend my Friday nights at St. Veronica's Church with a couple hundred, young hipsters wearing the colorful native costume that I'm wearing today. And, and then we would hop on our motorcycles afterwards and roar off into the East Village. I'll say a little more about this later, but sobriety had a massive impact on my creative work almost immediately, and has essentially allowed me to become a really authentic version of myself, because the fog that I lived in for many years, dissipated over a number of years, and I'm really thrilled to be here with you all today.
Hi, my name's Amanda Valdez. I'm an artist and I'm sober. I got sober in a small town outside of Seattle in 1999, and the years add up. But where I grew up, there was down by the river, there was a 2-story shack, and upstairs is where the alcoholics went. And one day my mom had to drive me in her minivan to where the alcoholics go. And I got a DUI. I had intervention. I was having to go to like a youth outpatient treatment, but I also had to go to meetings. And she was really nervous about taking me. I was nervous to go. And to me, it's just like the best analogy for sobriety. So she drops me off and I open the door, and it's just a set of stairs. You can't see where you're going. You smell the smoke. It's 1999. And they actually had a non-smoking section, which is like purely hilarious. It's like when airplanes had non-smoking. Old person moment. But all I could hear was this ruckusness and the smell of cigarettes. And that faith of just like having to go up the stairs and not know what you're walking into that's sobriety. And I say that like art and sobriety saved my life, as a, unhappy teenager with all those emotions and very complicated family life that included addiction in its past. Those two things in tandem really saved me. And it was really hard to get sober as a young person. I felt very out of place my last year of high school. I ended up going to college in different town, city. But for me, the way that those two intertwine is actually when I took the time and I was desperate enough to do the 12 steps. Like I was sober and I would hop around from sponsor to sponsor. But when I really was desperate enough and did the steps, all those principles translated to my art practice. And number one would be the principle of like accumulation, one day at a time. And so, my work can be very arduous, but it's just one strand of thread at a time. It's just one quilt block at a time. And it creates these things that are bigger than itself. And so I've always appreciated the way that the principles of recovery can translate into so many areas of life and things I was not able to accomplish once I did the steps and gained principles with each step. I was able to translate that. And I think that I'm like forever grateful for that. So.
Well, my name's Kasey Anderson. I first started off as a songwriter and musician. The last few years I have worked at the Alano Club of Portland, which is a recovery services organization in Portland. I got in my last drink in Seattle, and when I was kicked out of the city the following day, I don't think there was any paperwork, but I was kicked out of my band, and it was a fucking my band. Like, one of the people who worked for me kicked me out of my band. I was kicked out of my house by my roommate, and then my girlfriend was like, I think they have the right idea. I went to treatment, and it was the third time for me, and it took that toll. And then shortly after that, I was incarcerated, and I did worked a 12-step program where I was incarcerated, and then I came out. I think for creatively, being in recovery allowed me to have a practice and to treat it like a trade. And I can't speak to any other discipline, but I started to think about writing songs the way that I would think, like if I were a woodworker and I built a table, I know how to build a table, whether I'm fucked up or sober. And the advantage is that if I'm sober, I know that if one of the legs is shorter than the others, I'm able to identify that a lot quicker. So I can build songs now in a way that feels a lot better to me.
That's great. Thanks. So we're starting to get flashes of insight into people's process, which I love. I just love hearing about craft and process. But I'll introduce myself briefly. But my name is Erik Fisher. I am a psychiatrist, author, and bioethicist. For many, many years, I've been based here in Columbia, and I entered recovery while I was in medical school in the second year of residency, which is the training period after medical school. I was outwardly striving and achieving and trying to win grants and all the rest, but steadily falling apart to the point where it may be different from other folks, and I'd be curious to hear about this, but it wasn't a choice at first to stop drinking. And one thing this conference has really sparked for me is thinking about when it became stopping drinking versus entering recovery. But because by virtue of being a physician, I was hospitalized at an inpatient psychiatric center because I went on a binge with alcohol and stimulants and cocaine. And then I came to the attention of the state. And the state mandated if I wanted to practice as a physician, I would have to be abstinent and submit to regular urine tests. And so going along with what you said, Jan, there are a lot of people under coercive control in the carceral system, in parole, probation, etc. If I could export the version of coercion and compassionate control that is sometimes given lip service to all of the people who are experiencing that kind of coercion, it would be a far better system. For me, it was very person-centered, by virtue of being racialized as white and being very privileged. Like I was treated very compassionately through that process, even though I experienced it as controlling and undignified and all the rest. So that's all to say. It was a slow process for me to get on board with the notion of recovery and feeling intrinsically, not just the extrinsic imposition, that I wanted recovery for myself. And so I don't even know the answer. I identify as an alcoholic. I identify as a person in long-term recovery. I'm very hesitant to define what recovery means. I love the notion that you're in recovery if you say you are. I heard that that's a video from Jen as well. And I think we need a lot more of that in medicine. But in terms of my creative practice, I had a bunch of questions that my own home disciplines of neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, conceptual approaches to mental disorder, just weren't equipped to answer. I just knew I had the immediate first-person sense that psychiatry is a useful tool. It's often been used for ill, but, the people who are doing decent work are doing the best they can, but it just didn't, it couldn't answer the questions that I had for myself, like what had gone wrong with me, how did I wind up here, why did it feel like I was powerless and out of control, and I had to turn to the social sciences and especially the humanities for help with that. And so I didn't have a vision of myself as a writer or an artist, and it's been slowed for me to even step into that practice or identity, but just that's what I needed. That's what I needed to stay alive, basically. I needed that so that I could enter recovery, so that it could feel alive for me. And I really identify with the notion of trying to be a worker among workers and treating it like a craft and not making it into something fancier than it really is. But I love hearing about craft because I feel like I know nothing about craft. I'm just a physician who wandered into trying to do something at least artistically adjacent. Is there anyone else that wants to speak more about the process, or Jen, in your case, working in clergy or advocacy? Like, what is it like to bring principles of recovery, however you think of recovery, into your other spheres of work and practice?
I think for me that piece of authenticity is really significant, and And because I don't ever want to lose that, growing up I lost it, or probably didn't have it in the first place. My father, I didn't grow up in an addictive system per se. My father had a lot of power. He was a two-star general, and so kind of sometimes even in the conversation around privilege, I shirk because, again, my experience with privilege, even as a black woman who identifies as gay, I didn't have those issues. I mean, when we lived overseas, it was about being from the United States and being an American, and so the community was present, and we had a sense of belonging. And I didn't experience racism until I came back to the U.S. And so, for me, I've been able to, we call it in the advocacy recovery space, we talk about being bicultural. So I can float in and out of 12-step rooms, NA rooms, Celebrate Recovery. I mean, wherever I need to go, I'm going to go for my personal recovery. And then I can step out and deliver a sermon in one of the oldest Anglican churches in the United States. And so for me, a lot of it is about being literate and being able to translate. We talk a lot about recovery capital, and then I go to the larger world, and they're like, what? But they speak social determinants of health, and so I need to know that. I think the other piece I would say that's been really helpful is your word on cultural humility. We hear a lot about cultural competency, and again, I struggled with that concept because I'm never going to be versed in Black culture. What I can do is say that I don't know, and I can go and learn, and those are the things that have allowed me to progress to this place where, when I introduced myself, I said I have a life beyond my wildest dreams. And so, being able to intersect with systems in ways that others don't get the opportunity. The religious tradition that I serve in is 99.8% white. And so, people talk about the hostility, and I'm sure that it's there. I was sharing last night during my water discussion with the young person that I was with, and I said, I don't have those pieces, and I get to then use my voice and my power for good. For many years, I didn't, and so I'm really grateful that I get to these days, and it's really a privilege to be able to do so. And I don't know if I answered your question.
No. Anybody else want to expand on or talk more about craft, process, practice, how recovery? Paul, I would love to hear more.
Yeah, sure. What I was just thinking about as Jan was speaking was the idea of service, and one of the co-founders of AA famously said the whole program boils down to love and service. And I'm looking at the panel going, it's all about service here. That's really, in some sense, I think what we're all doing. And that idea of being of service was really transformational for me once I got sober, because that became the mission. And so the thrust of my work as an artist became that. How can I be of service as an artist? And, it can be self-aggrandizing to think, oh yeah, I'm being of service as a visual artist. It can be a pretty pretentious notion, but nonetheless, that was the way I started to think about it. And it kind of took the emphasis off my own ego and am I being acknowledged for what I'm doing? And, that whole sort of art world competitive thing went away because that was no longer the mission. And so that allowed me to get out of my own way in a sense, and try to figure out what was important to me in terms of what I had to contribute.
Yes.
And, I mean, I guess that concept of service, it goes in different directions. I mean, one thing I do as an artist is I make a little money, and that's in the service of my partner and our child. Like I'm actually able to think of it as a job, like I'm a woodworker, and I'm just executing this stuff in the service of my family and supporting them. But one of the things that happened early on is that I was I guess in my first or second year of sobriety, I was surrounded by people who in recovery, and I was struck by the before and after stories, right? These train wrecks, these like just lives that had just been, myself included, but these lives that were just like, were a second away from rolling into the ditch and never getting back out of it. And what I saw around me, a couple, or people with, 3 years of sobriety, which was like, oh my God, 3 years? You've managed to do this for 3 years? But these people's lives, they were turning into these very beautiful and useful human beings again, with gifts to give that they were finding a way to give. And I wanted to make some kind of work about that, about seeing that. And I didn't know what to do. I started to see these crushed beer cans lying around the streets of my neighborhood in Queens, and collecting them and bringing them into the studio because they, to me, were emblematic of active alcoholics, like discarded, littered, crushed, run over by life, soiled, just had no value. And I spent 6 months pondering what to do with these things and trying different things. And I finally cut one of these flattened beer cans into a butterfly shape. And I went, oh, that's it right there. The butterfly is this universal symbol of transformation and rebirth. That's what I'm trying to get at. And that turned into these sort of flocks of butterflies that, cascade across walls. And that, at first I was not really interested in disclosing where that work was coming from, that this was about, this process of transformation that I saw in recovery. And the work got identified as being more about recycling, and here's a guy taking litter from the trash of New York, and look what he's doing. And I was fine with that because I also have a deeply held concern for ecological issues, and then that turned into a body of work that I have done for upwards of 30 years now, and only recently am I going, okay, I'm in my 32nd year of recovery. I am now willing to just put it out there. I'm not going to run for political office. There's no risk for me at this point. Of course, being mindful of the traditions of the 12-step program and trying to find a way to do that dance with anonymity, because I don't want to become a face of recovery, right? I think there's a danger in doing that. But I'm willing to try to disclose this part of my story in my work now. And so it's just kind of interesting to me that this thing I stumbled on in early sobriety became a central part of my experience as an artist for these many years, and it's kind of taken on a life of its own. So there's a story.
That's beautiful. Thanks. And it's a beautiful segue or potential segue. I mean, whatever else you two want to talk about, but good from process to content and what it feels like to do work about recovery, whatever that means in art or otherwise.
Yeah, I have something I can say. So my work mostly is abstract. It's these large, sturdy shapes. There's actually 2 catalogs in that free book section over there, so you could look for yourself. But I bring together a lot of materials. So I'm sewing, I'm quilting, I'm embroidering, painting, drawing on the surface. And I never want my work to be very didactic. I'm reading these books and now my work is about that thing. Or did we all hear that podcast? Well, now my work's also about invisibility, or, whatever the topic du jour is, the zeitgeist. So And that's because I want my work to be able to communicate with as many bodies as possible. My shapes don't have a age, my shapes don't have a size, my shapes mostly don't have a gender. They don't have an ethnicity. And so, people have like a very bodily response to my work, and I really value that. So I've really kept a certain autobiographical element out of my work. And I think you could connect that idea of like anonymity, right? Anonymity in the rooms, anonymity as a maker in a certain way while having like a very specific style. But what's interesting is that for my last exhibition in New York, which was titled Gratitude, which was based off of a gratitude list I'm on with a handful of women, most of whom I've never actually met in person, that someone connected us to. And the gratitude list has just been this amazing place where people just write in their email what they're grateful for. And it's so highly personal, and it's so deeply moving. And I was coming out of the pandemic. I was coming out of having a child. I was coming out of having lost my dad, like all in that, like a 6-month period of time, 9-month period of time. All those 3 things happened. Yada, yada, pandemic. And now I'm doing it, it was like my 2nd or 3rd show after the pandemic. But I just felt the need to be more generous with like who I was behind the paintings, and to be a little more forthcoming. So what I did is I published a gratitude list, and it's in the catalog. It's the gratitude catalog that's over there. And it was really honest. And it was just like the gratitude list I would put out to a group, on this email chain. And the response was so overwhelming. And it created this other level of humanity with my audience. And I would try to be poetic with my titling of my pieces to kind of give some type of emotional insight beyond what you would see happening. And it was really moving to me the way that became a center around the conversations I was having with my exhibition. And so to speak to what I'm percolating right now, which is process, which I would usually like never talk about publicly, is I do a lot of weaving in my work as well, and then I take those woven fabrics and I sew them into canvas and then stretch it. So I'm constructing and engineering the surface from the ground up. And after my dad passed, my brother took most of his stuff and like stored it at his house in Los Angeles. And so my dad died of a drug overdose, and it took us 9 months to find out from the coroners. And I had no idea he was using again. And when I was about 9, he got sober. He got clean. There's, a distinction, but he got clean. I remember visiting him inpatient, and, he survived the crack epidemic. And, him and my mom had separated, and he was living alone, and had started using drugs again, and we didn't know it. And so currently what I'm percolating is like writing this personal essay and a new body of work, but I'm taking the suit that he wore to my wedding, and then when he wore it to my brother's wedding, it didn't fit him anymore because he'd lost so much weight. And he told us it was because there was he had a stomach bacteria, which both could be true, that he was being treated for. But, my brother got married in LA, it was hot, and my dad had put all these clothes on underneath of him. Under the suit, he was sweating like crazy, like, Dad, what are you doing? And it didn't connect. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to shred the wedding suit and weave it in. And then, I don't know what the work's going to look like, but I'm sharing that I feel an increased desire to, even through abstraction, to make the work more personal, a little bit more autobiographical. But it's, with addiction, it's not, there's so many people who are affected by it. And I've had this struggle in my own life to what my life looks nothing like where I came from. And the discrepancy is very confusing for me sometimes. And I keep all that because in the art world, I didn't know what I was signing up for, but it's, there's a lot of people who don't come from where I came from in the art world. And it's not, it's you either trade, you either use these things my dad was shot twice and I grew up like this and he was stabbed and this is real. You use those as trading cards, right, to be sensational, which is not what I've wanted to do. or you have to just, act like you know what hotel your collector's talking about in Italy, And so, I'm like threading a needle in some ways, but I feel like the veil of addiction continues to come down in society. And I think that there's ways I can introduce some of this content to my work without it being didactic. And so, I think that's where I'm at with my process right now.
I have struggled with anonymity. I have not personally struggled with it, but as I said, I was incarcerated. There were news vans at my folks' home and at the place that people thought that I lived when I was indicted, and it was in a number of national and music publications. It was not much of a secret that I was struggling. It was not much of a secret that I went to prison, and then it was not much of a secret that I was in treatment. I do try to be mindful of the traditions of the recovery meetings that I go to. But yeah, I mean, I was pretty publicly fucked up, and I've been pretty publicly in recovery for the time that I've been in recovery. And I don't mind it. I mean, I understand what you're saying about being a face of recovery, and I think I think I understand the way that you use that term, and I also think that, you could maybe speak to this too. Sometimes in advocacy, you kind of have to be. And now that I'm doing less songwriting and working more for the organization that I work for, I'm on the news for different reasons. I'm talking about policy, or I'm talking about programs or whatever, and I don't mind being a face of recovery in those situations. In terms of practice, I also try not to be didactic, and I try not to be prescriptive, and I try to, I write autobiographical songs in that I'm the person who writes the song, so there's going to be part of me in my work. But I've never been able to sit down and say, like, I'm going to write this kind of song. And it doesn't matter, like I tried to write a love song for my wife, and the entire first verse was about death. I try, if I try to write a recovery song, it's not going to be a song that I want to play for people or share with people. I think there's a degree to which that stuff kind of turns into like Christian rock. You know what I mean? And I don't mean like topically, I mean that like Christian rock is different from worship music, which is different from gospel music, right? Christian rock they're just selling the shit that people already think they believe back to them. I don't have any interest in doing that when it comes to recovery.
I love that. We're already talking a lot about anonymity. Do other people want to chime in?
Yeah, I'll chime in. I was giggling when Paul was talking about not being the face of recovery. I am the former board chair of an organization called Faces and Voices of Recovery. It's like, but as part of the recovery advocacy movement, and how I introduce myself in public spaces, I mean, that too has evolved. There is a way to do advocacy with anonymity. For a long time, I would introduce myself as I'm Jan and I'm an addict. And what I would see when I was speaking to audiences is that they would put their head down, they would grab their phone, some might grab their pocketbook. So I lost all credibility because people have a notion of what an addict is. And then through my initial advocacy work, we learned how to say, my name is Jan, I'm a person in long-term recovery, and what that means to me is I haven't used drugs or alcohol, da-da-da-da-da. And then we would say, and what that allowed, and then people aren't listening anymore, it's like, and that means that I'm this, and I'm doing this, and, what it really means is I live the way the rest of society lives, and I'm doing the things I'm supposed to do, and you're supposed to clap for me. Now it really is about, my name is Jan, I'm a woman in recovery, or recognize the fact that I survived addiction, because all of us have that in common. And so since we can't come up with a definition of recovery, we do know what use disorder and addiction are all about. And so, I don't have to talk about the particular fellowship that I may or may not be a member of. Sometimes because anonymity is really about press, radio, and film. I remember years ago going to visit a woman who was in the same mutual support fellowship that I'm in, and I went to visit her at the hospital, and I didn't know her last name. And it was like, huh, okay, I'm here to see so-and-so, and then people are like, you're not getting in to see her. And so it's like, well, that type of anonymity didn't make sense to me. And so, I do believe that the principle of anonymity, particularly when we look at things like the traditions, I think we're losing a lot of this thing called unity, which the first tradition is about in some mutual support groups. And so, we need to, if we're really going to kind of honor the steps and the spiritual principles that transcend all of the mutual support groups that are around there, that there is a way to do it, and to just, you don't have to make reference to your specific pathway or style of recovery or any of those kinds of things. But to let people see, everybody knew, and you were just talking about it, everybody knew what a person who's a train wreck and their life destroyed looks like. And then when we don't let people know that we can and do recover, that's where stigma and things like that are perpetuated.
Other thoughts? I can jump in. When I think about anonymity, I think there's like a sneaky, superficial way to talk about it, and then a deeper way. And for me, the sneaky, superficial justification for me talking about being in recovery, and especially as someone who clinically and academically and at a policy level is deeply, deeply committed to many different pathways of recovery, I say, and I even do this move in my book a little bit, to say that my real recovery is not necessarily the traditional 12-step path that it's found in Buddhist recovery, which is sort of an alternative to, but not different from, or in opposition to more traditional forms of recovery. And to be perfectly frank, I don't know the answer to, and I also don't think it's useful for me to think about what percentage of this versus that pathway or camp I belong to. For me, the deeper question about anonymity is more internal. It's more about the cautions against ego in self and constructing a persona, because my whole process, my own personal process of recovery and coming to terms with addiction has been one of a really strong allergy to fixed and firm ideas about what this is. I really dislike a lot of the narrative around the disease model. I really dislike a lot of what my own field, contemporary psychiatry, talks about mental disorders as if they are somehow essential elements of human life. And so I really am personally committed to holding the notion of a person in recovery and of someone who is a survivor of addiction very loosely, while still simultaneously feeling like, yeah, I had addiction. My parents had it. It's not that complicated at the end of the day. Like I had it. I qualify for sure. And so I don't know. I think like the sneaky way of just saying like, oh, maybe that rule doesn't apply to me, kind of is the way I justified writing about my experience. But the deeper sense of looking at ego, looking at self, looking at persona or constructed ideas of who I think I am, is just an ongoing process, and I don't think it has an answer necessarily. But I do, like when I talk to advocates, I hear people say, and this really resonated with me, and I took it very reassuring for some of the things I had chosen to go public about. I've heard people say, if you have the privilege to do so, then please recover out loud. If you are able to do that, that's not for everyone. It's not the path, but there's no, and the way that people can recover out loud can take many different forms, right? In terms of the way you identify yourself or talk about a particular path. But I heard this in the first panel. I heard it in the second panel today. Like, if stigma is one of the big concrete obstacles that is actually literally killing people today, how do we fight stigma? I mean, we can come up with policy statements, or we can have op-eds about it, but really I think it's through story. It's through actually having a human connection with someone sharing their experience. And And I don't even know if that's like a clear formulation of like what to do for myself. I don't think I think it's still a work in progress, I guess is what I'm saying. But even just in this panel, I love hearing about how people think about anonymity. It helps me a lot.
Well, you just made me realize. So a friend of mine just got sober off TikTok. So talking about like stigma and anonymity, like he told me I'm not on TikTok, but there's like sober talk. And it's a guy who's just drinking his beers every night. You know, a friend of mine, hasn't really got where he wants to in life, never identified as an alcoholic. And somehow he unlocked sober TikTok in his algorithm, and there's all these personal coaches, and it's like not totally 12-step, which is cool, but it's like a whole other version of just like, I don't know what, because I'm not on it, but, you know, he like really looked at his alcohol problem and got sober through it and is very much, you know, whatever, on his journey. But to speak of anonymity and stigma, to like just put it on this massive social media channel and have it as this real entity and that it is helping people is pretty wild to me. Because again, it's like that old, like I grew up in a small town. So when I started going to AA, I would see the like woman who had 2 kids in the grocery line while I was in the grocery line with my mom. And you just kind of are like you don't acknowledge each other in that way, because it was very strict anonymity in a small town. Whereas like, you know, now I live in the East Village with my husband who's not in sobriety. And even my son, my 4-year-old, I'll just be saying hi to random people. And he's like, how do you know that 65-year-old? Like, what are you doing? You know, like, what are you doing saying hi to like so-and-so, you know? And my husband just knows now when I say hi to random people. Because the anonymity is not as strict, you know, someone's not afraid to say just hi to me. Whereas where I grew up and 24 years ago, you didn't, or you would say, I'm friends with Bill. Like you would suss each other out and either the door was closed or the door flew open. But yeah, sober talk. So
They have these like quasi-secret doctors meetings of people in recovery, and they're helpful to me because a lot of people have the experience of like not sharing in mutual help groups, like not sharing that they're a physician or a provider. And then that I heard in one of those groups once, say, you're on the witness protection program. Like, it's not that important. You're not that important. So maybe just relax.
When you said got sober off TikTok, I thought you meant like quit TikTok.
Yeah. There's a program for that too. I'll show you though. It's not made.
TikTok.
Yeah.
So I think another topic that we're glancing against, but it came up in some of our discussions prior to the panel, was ideas about recovery and inclusivity around thinking about recovery. Like, how is the idea of what constitutes recovery expanded over time, and then how does that manifest in our personal lives or professional lives? Is there anyone that wants to speak to that? I feel like I keep on putting you on the spot, Jan, but like I feel like this is really in your wheelhouse, and also it maybe gets to something that I would love to hear more about, which is also how your practice in recovery manifests in some of your advocacy work. I think a lot of us are maybe not necessarily advocates, and would love to hear more about that.
Sure. Well, and it's funny because when John invited me, and as I've been here, it's like, I am not an artist. I don't have thick enough skin to be an artist. I mean, somebody would say, gosh, that doesn't look very good, or not pay what I wanted them to pay, and I'd be done. So advocacy, I'm going to stay in my lane. But one of the things that keeps coming up around, for example, like stigma, you know, I've been with the Surgeon General, and one of the things that he states often is that stigma kills more people than anything else. And this idea of sharing our stories, and yet over 110,000 people died last year. So is that in and of itself the solution? And I would suggest that it's not. You know, that piece of recovery identity, you know, things that always stir through my brain. They say there's, up until 2 days ago, there were 25 million people in recovery as of this report that came out from SANSA. The other day, there are 20.9 people either in recovery or recovered. And, I've always wondered if there's really that many people and we each throw a buck and, donated $1, we wouldn't have a problem with money. And so, a lot of the things that I have learned through the years, in the particular pathway I started and kind of where I am now just never made sense to me. And I was one, if you say, don't do this, I'm going to do this. And, one of the things that they told us when I was in rehab is, don't get into a relationship. And, and so what did I do? I waited 366 days. I was no more ready on day 364 than I was on 366 to be in a relationship. But, I just didn't because that's what they told me to do. And so, again, that didn't make sense to me. And so, really trying to dig underneath, what are you really saying to me? What you're really saying to me is that you're immature, you're self-centered. I could get behind that, even though I'd be pissed off at you for saying it in the first place. So, this piece of stigma there, it's, I was talking to the young person last night, and I said there are different kinds of stigma. So when we just kind of blanket the word stigma, there's healthcare stigma, for example. And one of the things that we do, is we've learned about it at the center that I run. And for a lot of healthcare professionals, they didn't learn about addiction in medical school. They don't see people get better, particularly those who are working in the emergency rooms. And we're pains in the asses when we come in, and we're combative, and you've messed up my high, and et cetera, et cetera. And so what we do to combat that is, when somebody that I know in the community has, we call them drug poisonings, because I've also never seen a proper dosage of an illicit drug yet. So when we go with them, right? And so the people can see that they're connected to another human being. And we stay with them. So in the context of an ER, the people who can work with other folks who are there, because sometimes what we need is time in that space. And so we're sitting right there, and we can interface with, and it's like, they were starting to create a little bit of dissonance. And then when the people get out, we make them go back and say, hey, thank you for what you've done. Again, another piece of it's like, well, gosh, you said thank you. And then later on, we continue to go back so that they can see that people can and do recover. And if somebody doesn't make it, we can still appreciate the effort that was made on whoever's behalf. Again, because it's like, I was telling Paul, and I guess she's gone now, but I was at this Mobilized Recovery Conference, and this is going to be recorded, but oh well, this past week, and just kind of, it was a room full of advocates and activists and yay us, and and it's like, okay, wow, we're sitting in the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C., right? It's like one of those things that really upset my thinking, because it's like, gosh, all of the good that we could be doing, number one, and then we want to talk about, racist ways, et cetera, and calling things out, and it's like, folks, do you realize where we're sitting? So, I mean, there's so much internalized stigma that we have as a community and as a movement that we've got to get over. And you're right, I do. There was some quote, I didn't even remember saying it, about recovering out loud. And I was reading the CBS News article the other day, and it's like, that was me. I don't even remember talking to that lady. But there it was. And everybody can't do it, so those of us who can must. And it looks different ways. I mean, as I've been sitting here, it's like, okay, well, what kind of form of art could I get into? And it's like, well, maybe I could write, because I can't do what these two were talking about doing, and certainly not what John does with his creativity. But so I'm going to figure something out before I leave about, okay, if I want to hang out with this amazing group of people, I gotta get to this creative part. So, and I'm really glad to get to be here, because I think there's an opportunity, again, that bicultural nature of my recovery is to learn the language and learn this culture and be able to raise it up too, and potentially bring some of you along with me when I get to go amazing places like Mobilized Recovery at the Mayflower. Anybody want to go to the Mayflower Hotel? Go ahead.
I probably do what I do. You write songs. It's not that. It's not hard. I do think that it's worth calling out that, and you kind of alluded to this, that there is a lot of stigma within recovery. I mean, the recovery community is a community in the same way any other. There are fractions of the recovery community, and there are a lot of fractions of the recovery community that don't make room for harm reduction and that don't believe that you're in recovery when you say you are, and that can be really prescriptive. And I think that that's just as harmful as healthcare recovery or systemic stigma or healthcare stigma or anything like that. So I think that that's worth calling out and saying that there's a lot of work to be done.
Here. Yeah. In epidemiology, they call it the clinician's illusion, where if somebody is having problems, whether it's with depression or substance use disorders or otherwise, and they're having repetitive problems, they come back into the same physician's office, and so then the individual physician thinks that recurrent visitor is representative of the group as a whole. The people you don't see are the people who find other pathways of recovery, and I think that's everywhere, and that's part of what feeds into the internalized stigma to different recovery pathways. And I think that's another part of the calculus, right? Is speaking about the process of recovery as a way of undoing that internalized stigma, in the same way that speaking about the process of recovery writ large is a way of speaking about and undoing that stigma in the general public. At least I would like to think so, while still being thoughtful about the principles, internal and external, to that, put the brakes on just dumping it all out entirely. I feel like I can get to Paul because we're talking about recovering out loud, and we talked about like trading cards, and I don't know how comfortable you are, or how much you would want to go into detail, but like how is your identity as a person in recovery played into just the way you navigate putting your art out there, and where have you run into choices? We had a conversation about this, and I'm being intentionally vague because I want to leave the reins in your hand, but any tough choices about identifying as a person in recovery as you work as an artist?
I mean, I think in a sense it's all kind of a tough choice, which is getting to what we're really talking about here. I do think it's very funny that I said the thing about faces of recovery. And, I mean, I don't work in this field. I don't spend a huge amount of time thinking about these issues, but for me, a concern, and I will get to your question, Carl, but I'm kind of like, I kind of am here to represent the old white recovering guys in the right. I mean, and so like what I came up with was my sponsor saying, look, we're anonymous because you can't go out there and represent AA, because if you fail, everyone is looking and going, oh, well, let's see that guy, he's the face of AA and he failed. It doesn't work. Or they don't like you. They don't like the particular brand of person you are. I don't want to go to a meeting with a bunch of old white guys. I'm not good. That's what's in AA. I'm not going there. That to me made a lot of sense, that we don't want to characterize AA as being full of people just like me, Now, having said that, I think, like Jan, like you said, 20.9 million people in America in recovery, and no one knows about this, it's a massive failure in terms of shaping public policy, right? I mean, I make myself available as a person in recovery to basically everyone I know. So I get a lot of phone calls from people, my son is in detox. Can you come with me? Let's help me figure this out. And I just did that. And every time I go through that with somebody, it's a fantastic struggle to find a bed in a rehab for 28 days, right? I mean, and that I think is fundamentally because in this country, we don't know there's 20 plus million people in recovery. Like there's a constituency that needs to be served that's not being served. So I am at a point in my own life where I'm willing to say I'm in recovery. I'm still trying to figure out how I do that without saying I'm in AA, and I'm breaking my anonymity to all of you here. But, every time, Jan, you said, you're living a life beyond your wildest dreams, straight out of the big book, we have all this codified language that we're using. So, and it is the mothership. I mean, great. There's lots of pathways, but this is the mothership. It's been around for almost 80 years now, and it survives. It continues where all this other stuff falls away, So I'm deeply respectful of these traditions, and I'm trying to find a way to negotiate them while publicly acknowledging that I'm in recovery. And so what Carl's referring to is this sort of interesting thing that happened where I had a piece brought into the collection of the Smithsonian Museum last year, and when the curator said, the committee's considering this work, I spoke with a friend of mine who happened to be aware of what was going on there, and he said, they're never going to take your piece. They do not want, work by white men any longer. They're looking to collect a bunch of work by people of color, other constituencies. I said, well, fair enough, I mean, we had our 2,000 years, go men, but this curator had shown this work 20 years earlier, and this was a work that was about recovery. It was about, it was a textile piece, basically comprised of a couple hundred gloves sewn together, and it was called Comforter, and it was about my early experience in AA where people were holding hands and comforting each other, and this was a sort of image of a protective blanket that, and I told her, well, that's what this piece was, that's where it came from for me, and so she shared that, and the museum took the piece into their collection and put it in this show that's happening in DC right now. And I went down for the opening of the show, and all that information is in the, the didactic label on the wall there, right? And I thought, oh, that's so interesting because, yeah, I'm a 60-plus-year-old white guy. I've had all the privilege that, Caucasians in the United States have. But that being identified as a person in recovery is this kind of otherness, right? That allowed this committee to say, well, this is this guy's, story, right? This is his challenge, and he belongs in this context. And so I don't know where I'm going with this. I just shared it with Carl earlier, and I just thought, wow, it's really kind of interesting that put me in that position. And, and now I do want to make work that directly confronts my autobiography, because my modus operandi as an artist is basically this idea of identification, right? Another thing that comes out of the program, right? I grew up listening to certain singer-songwriters, who they'd express something, and I'd go, oh, God, that person knows exactly how I feel. I'm not alone in this world because there's someone expressing just what I feel, right? And that feeling of identification was very important to me. And that's what I try to do as an artist now. I do want to make stuff and people go, oh, I can't be alone. There's another guy who knows what I'm talking about. I'm not alone in this world. That's what I try to do. So I need to do that now about this process of, addiction and recovery. I mean, with that being the goal, and I don't know how to do it yet. I mean, so, stay tuned, I guess.